For anyone who's watching, Rick is my coach. He's helping me prepare for a cycling event that I have in June. And we actually just met a few weeks ago and got the ball rolling. And then, like, two workouts in, I got hit with COVID. And now he's helping me, on one hand, psychologically, trying to stay patient with everything as I recover, but also has his own personal experiences in COVID and long COVID now. So we decided to film this chat that we're going to have today as he kind of guides me through the post COVID experience. And hopefully it's useful for anyone watching.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great idea. I think there's very limited information out there when it comes to returning to sport following up like post-COVID. And the experience is very different depending on how COVID affects you. It just released a report here in Canada not that long ago saying that 15% of everybody who's infected with COVID ends up with long COVID or post-COVID condition. And that is defined as having lingering symptoms past 3 months. So that means dealing with all of this fatigue, breathlessness, cognitive problems, and all slew of these things. You have to have it for more than 3 months before they deem it long COVID. And that's just kind of mind-boggling to me that you have to get to that point before that's recognized as being a chronic problem. I guess I can get into a little bit of my story with things just to add some context. So my trajectory may be a little bit different than some people's, and I learned more along the way, like as things developed. So I came to learn after I got COVID that my initial problems were actually stemming from the vaccine. Before I actually was infected with COVID, there's a recognized vaccine injury now, and I was having sort of the lightheaded cognitive problems, head pressure during activity for months before I was infected with COVID, and I didn't understand what it was or have any help to understand what it was. Is kind of going out for a run, feeling quite disorientated in the woods. Some days would be better than others. Some days I can run through it, and some days I couldn't. And being an endurance athlete, I just have the nature to kind of push through it and deal with it. And it was never really bad enough that I sought a whole lot of help to deal with it. I just kind of self-managed and adjust my training and didn't run on days when I felt particularly dizzy or full of vertigo. But there were signs before I got infected with COVID that it was more of an issue than I was giving it credit for. For instance, I went out and did a 50-kilometer loop here on a local trail, and my body was essentially giving up at a distance that I can more than comfortable get out and spend 10 hours plus in the woods, just kind of chill, having an adventure with friends. But my body just essentially gave up, and it was a really big struggle, and that's not normal for my level of conditioning. And then in the fall, I'd signed up for a 100-miler. And again, my body just completely shut down before the 50K mark. And that is very early in. And I was literally having to take like a trail nap. And that is just unheard of, like that early into a 100-mile race. I ended up pulling the cord and just deeming it was unsafe just because I was so dizzy and so out of it at around the 70K mark. So I didn't even make it to halfway. And this is before I got infected. So then December comes around and I actually get COVID before Christmas. And it was kind of bad. Like I had a really bad cough. And I could understand at the time, like how people might end up in the hospital. Like I found it quite hard to breathe in between like my coughing fits, which felt like they were rattling the entire house. Like it was, I've never coughed like that before in my life, but it was 2 days and it had come and gone. And I was like, okay, I'm over this. I can kind of get back into training kind of thing. And quickly realized I gave it some time and just kind of went through the holidays and tried to resume things in the new year to find that speaking in metric units, I was down over 2 minutes per kilometer in my average sort of easy pace on flat ground. And I was having a pretty hard time breathing. You can probably almost kind of hear it in my voice now too. I kind of gasp a bit in between sentences. So I'm still dealing with this since like well over a year since COVID infection. That's where things started to get really interesting for me because going through January into February, the cognitive problems started affecting my work. So not only am I an endurance coach, I'm also a professional bridge engineer and work for one of the leading bridge engineering firms in the world, senior structural designer in charge of multiple teams doing very complicated engineering things. And basically, I was having meetings with my team and then collapsing on the floor just because I was in so much discomfort. The pressure in my head, the throbbing in my spine, just unmanageable. And
Wow.
again, being an endurance athlete, I was pushing through this for 2 to 3 months before my wife is, I was like, we got to get help on this, right? And my work was fantastic. Like they were giving me reduced hours, allowing me to take frequent breaks, but I just wasn't getting better. And at the same time, I didn't want to give up training. So I'm running. I gave up running in the woods, as running on the road just because of the intense vertigo that I was getting and just kind of laughing that I might like stumble off into traffic because I was feeling so like dizzy and out of it, but I could still run. And like things were okay. Like my pace was still significantly decreased and wasn't really pushing myself, but I was able to do it. Eventually, come March, I'm out of sick time, talking with work. I need to kind of get my ducks in a row to get on short-term disability. And that's a very frustrating process to say the least. But then going through that process is just like you're not okay. Like you should not be working. And then not even like from a professional standpoint is like I can't design bridges and be responsible for like personal safety of the public right now. And just for a month leading up to that, I was just refusing to stamp drawings and things as well, like actually be professionally liable for things. So that's kind of how I was feeling. And the doctor, like very fortunate to have a family doctor. A lot of people here in Nova Scotia, particularly in Canada, but throughout Canada, there's a family doctor shortage. So a fair large amount of people don't have that constant contact for care. So I have that. My doctor was great in acknowledging that I had a problem. I've heard a lot of horror stories where you don't have that acknowledgement and got the full battery of tests, all the blood work, got referred to specialists, neurological assessments, CT scans, chest x-rays, all the full works, which come back and say that you're normal. There's nothing wrong with you. Um, so that wasn't a whole lot of help. And then you're just left in this limbo where you're stuck and you feel terrible. And the medical system is telling you there's nothing that we can do for you. We have no idea when you're going to get better. And that's a fairly unacceptable position for a high performing person to be in, not only from an athletic point of view, but just from day-to-day life. Essentially, I had my own coaching business before joining up with Vital, and I had athletes stay on with me, but I wasn't getting any new athletes. Like I just not out in the community anymore, not doing any running, not pushing my own marketing. So my own business is collapsing. I have no more like life just ground to a halt essentially. And the only place that I'm finding that I was getting help, some support outside of people acknowledging that there's something wrong with me and getting put on disability, which is another thing to kind of, there's a lot of feelings that go along with being put on disability and saying that you have a cognitive problem. Not alone like your lungs don't work, but your brain doesn't work. That's kind of not a great place to be in and just dealing with that. But my naturopathic doctor was very supportive in actually helping me, giving things to help relieve my symptoms with supplements and treatments. And acupuncture is quite helpful, and osteopathy was quite helpful. But again, it's quite interesting that from the actual medical system, even though like my naturopathic doctor can point me to certain groups of published research of protocols of treatment for COVID and long COVID, that there's no acknowledgement of this from the medical professionals that are helping you with actual treatment protocols. So even though there's like lists of pharmaceuticals that can supposedly help you, they deny their efficacy and won't prescribe them to you.
Mm,
So they're saying there's nothing we can do to help you. And you're like, hey, here's this research of stuff. And these people say they can help me, but you won't give it to me, kind of thing.
mm,
So it's kind of a frustrating spot to be in. Again, being that athlete mentality, like I have no problem pushing through and doing whatever you will tell me to get better,
mhm, mhm,
but saying there's nothing that you can do and you're just kind of stuck for an indefinite amount of time, not being able to really participate in life. And just to be clear, it was so bad for me for like well over 8 months that I was essentially confined, like almost essentially in bed rest, like on the couch. Most of the time, couldn't even watch TV just because that made like the throbbing pressure in my head. Like you have to be there essentially in a dark room with your eyes closed with no noise, laying on the floor. And that's the only thing that gives you relief to your symptoms. Like it's awful. Force yourself out the door for a 20-minute walk once or twice a day just to get some movement and then back to laying down doing nothing.
Oh,
It's, yeah, it's pretty bad. And I'm not like saying this to frighten anybody, but this is just kind of what can happen. And essentially, what I've learned through this whole process that self-advocacy is very important.
mhm,
And it's okay to not be okay with the status quo and to keep pushing for things that can help you. Being finding those alternative supplements and remedies and treatments that can help. And specifically in the last couple of months, for me, stumbling upon this supplement. It's like a Japanese from some sort of extract from like something fermented in Japan. I don't even remember what it is, but it's called nattokinase, and it helps dissolve the microclots that build up in your
uh,
cardiovascular system. And that has made a world of difference for me. And I've gained back about a minute and 30 seconds out of my 2 minutes that I lost in the span of 2 months now. So I'm feeling like I'm getting my body back, but my cognitive issues are still lingering. So I'm still having some issues in that department. But again, you just kind of you learn to cope, you learn to pace, you learn to take breaks. Like I can do things now. I just sometimes have to realize that after I'm done, I have to go lay down with my eyes closed for an hour to kind of reset, right? So I'm just kind of dealing with it and learning the tips and tricks of how to navigate that whole field. So again, I've been off work now since May. And again, even just dealing with that insurance company and all of that issue has been a nightmare. And having them recognize that there's something wrong with me and that I can't work has not been a whole lot of fun either. Especially picture an endurance athlete explaining to the insurance company that this is not that big of a deal, guys. I'm okay to go for a 2 hour run on the weekend. I feel kind of out of it while I'm doing it, but I can't read. Like if I read, I'm just knocked unconscious. Like I just can't do it. And like ha having them understand that like is difficult, right? No, you must be okay if you can get out and do that sort of level of activity, right? But used to getting out and running for 10 to 36 plus hours, like is not an uncommon thing, right? So it's in the scale of things, it's difficult to explain that. So any questions on sort of like what I went through? I know that's not where you're currently at right now,
yeah, it
but
really
it is,
puts my complaints into perspective, I feel like, because I've been now like 2 weeks restricted, and I had, the first few days of kind of like the fever and the body aches and the cough, but then I've been like relatively able to get back to life without being overly active, and like obviously just feeling tired all the time, and also kind of minor headaches throughout the day, but otherwise like compare hearing you now makes me feel really dumb for complaining to myself about not being able to get fully back into sport yet. I guess I'm curious, like, what would you have done differently after? So you got sick and the cough went away. Like,
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that I've come to learn that I think would have been very beneficial early
mhm,
on. And both from pacing the return to activity and not forcing it when I didn't feel well. And quick aside to that is I was really forcing my comeback to activity in the spring. Like I was fed up with this thing and like I am getting better. I am going to run ultras and I am doing this now. I am fed up with this. And I ran a 27K trail race, which is essentially like a marathon type effort for road. And again, my lungs pretty much gave up on me about 3/4 of the way through that, but I was able to get through it without too much problems. But the final nail in my coffin was the next week. Had some friends going to do that 50-kilometer loop that I was telling you about, which is something that we kind of do fairly regularly around here. I wanted to go have some fun. So I went and did it. And very early on, I was having issues with my smell and my taste. Like my nutrition was tasting like rotten garbage, and I couldn't eat it without getting sick, which I thought was weird. And then my lungs like shut off and I started having bronchial spasms. And then I was 6 hours away from the car. So I had to get myself back, which was quite difficult and fairly traumatic, aside from calling for like a helicopter rescue when the park's closed. That's essentially where you're at, right? So a 10-hour day turned into like a 13-hour day, which in the grand scheme of things wasn't that I was able to keep going, but like my chest hurt. And I had a friend with me who was a cardiac surgeon who assured me it wasn't my heart at the time, that it was indeed bronchial spasms. I'd never had those before. And that's where things really went south for me after that. So as I pushed my body too hard and then it really snapped back. And then I had like 6 to 8 months of like bed rest after that. So that's learning that you have to be very careful in how much you push your body coming back from this because COVID can really snap back for months and
yeah.
just kind of sideline you for a very long time if you push too hard through it. Um,
Yeah. I think that's something, and you've spoken to it like a few times now, mentioning just like the mentality of pushing through things when things
yeah,
get hard as athletes, and finding a balance with that is it's really tough. So like, how, if you can go back in time, or for me now, how are we going to practice
yeah.
the moderation there?
So really important in our training log is that we need to track severity of symptoms. And it's things don't necessarily happen like right after activity either.
Mhm.
So how did you feel before you start activity? How did you feel afterwards is really important. And but then kind of cumulatively, like especially like for me specifically, I had two pretty good build weeks in my training. This past week, my symptoms were relatively mild. This last week, I pushed myself pretty hard, but then I found by the time that Sunday came, my symptoms were pretty elevated. The fuzzy head was there, my throbbing
Mm,
spine was there, feeling nauseous, like hard to kind of do things. So then I was like, well, it's just not worth it for me to go do this hour-and-a-half run right now. I will go try and do 30 to 40 minutes just to see how I feel, but I'm not going to push it. So if I'm really feeling like crap, I'm going to come home, kind of thing. And that's kind of rolled over for me the last 2 or 3 days as that's stuck around. So I've
yeah.
done less than I've wanted to do, and I've learned to be okay with that and not push it, and learn that it's okay to take the extra recovery day or extra day off and not beat myself up about it. And I've been able to do a lot more with that mentality and a lot more
Mm,
consistency with that
mm,
mentality than the I need to stick to this plan that I had. and I need to get this longer run in instead of
Oh,
taking less time because I'm not feeling good. So I think that that's really important. And then just realizing, again, we don't want to push things too hard, but, and I'm not saying that you're going to necessarily end up there, but to try and understand where that tipping point is, know
mm,
that if we brush up against it, we're okay. But if we have this much training load and we go this little bit over it, then you're 2 to 3 days of
yeah.
trying to bounce back from that kind of thing. So it's really important to track.
But so I'm curious for you because it kind of sounds like you always have some kind of symptoms. I mean,
Yeah.
I feel like when you're stuck in feeling shitty, like how do you gauge that was too much? Now you said there'd be like more intense symptoms, but so for in my case right now, I mean, I feel like relatively okay, but there's like these moments of like, oh, I feel shitty or I still need to sleep a lot. Like I sleep 10 hours and I still feel exhausted when I wake up. But then as the day goes on, okay, it starts to get better. And I think, yeah, I feel like I could do something now. Like, yeah, I just struggle with how to gauge the like true symptoms, if that would make sense. Like versus, yeah.
All right. I guess probably should have said this at the beginning. I guess I'm not a medical professional, but I do have just my own experience to share. And it's best to, I find an attitude of cautious optimism
Mm,
is good. Um, so in terms, I won't go and run if I haven't, like if I'm to rate things on a light, moderately bad, and terrible. I won't run if anything is more than moderate. Like I'll just call it quits. And when I'm saying that, I'm thinking about general fatigue and how fuzzy, lightheaded I'm feeling. And the way things are now, more often than not, I'm finding after about a half hour of running, the increased oxygen and blood flow actually helps my fuzzy head feel better. So it's again, and that sometimes helps get me out the door and at least to start and try when I'm feeling bad is to not necessarily 100% give into that, but be aware and be cautiously optimistic that it might not get better kind of thing. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah. I think also your scale, like your own subjective scale that you mentioned, helps you kind of track across time through the like
Yeah.
feeling the same all the time, but not really the same.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
And the thing too is that your scale gets skewed a little bit when you're stuck more in the I feel like really bad all the time.
yeah.
But for me, then I got these like 2 or 3 days where I actually felt normal. I was like, oh, that's actually what things are supposed to feel like.
Oh, geez.
So
Yeah,
I normally feel a lot worse than that kind of thing. So
yeah.
sometimes your scale can um, get shifted a little
I
bit.
and I think also as soon as you do start to feel normal, you kind of probably get like an energy that comes with that, and your impulse will
And
be
then
like, okay,
oh,
I
you
want to
want
go
to
do
go and
everything.
push, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, you
yeah,
want to go and get back to it and push, push, push. It's kind of that endurance
yeah,
mentality as well. So just got to be sure that we're not doing that either. We need to sustainably build up and keep things under that threshold of setting things backwards.
yeah.
And again, hopefully we find with you in the next like so we're approaching 2 weeks now, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, so hopefully within the next week or so, we'll find that this essentially goes back to normal. And
Yeah.
that's what happens for most people, right? And we'll proceed with cautious optimism that that's where we're going to be going. But I think being aware of what some of these other symptoms are that you might like, there's a big education component to this that is not like readily out there to you. Because I see in your notes that you're complaining of some things like you had a sore neck,
Mm,
right? And I know from my experience that that pain in my neck is COVID.
mm,
And I'm not necessarily saying that's 100% what's going on with you, but I'm aware of that. So, like that pain, it's kind of like this deep pain that's like in the spine, like portion of
Mm.
my neck. It almost feels like you got a bit of a cranked neck and it just hurts.
Ugh.
And like that's a symptom of neurological issues with associated with COVID. And that fuzzy head pressure stuff, that's from COVID as well. So just knowing that is part of it is important. So knowing that that's part of what you need to be keeping track of.
Yeah, I
Um,
think like expectations have a lot to, or like more clarity in general for people or for athletes around expectations when you are like coming back to normal. Because I think it is unlike any other kind of flu that you would have experienced, right? So like I guess there are some return to play protocols that are coming out now, but even I don't know if as people, I think we tend to think we're like the exception to the rule a lot of the time. And you're like, oh, yeah, everyone else can do like 3 weeks before they exercise, but I mean, also, or I don't know, stuff like that. So I think just talking about it is hopefully.
I think it's very important, and it's where individualization plays such a huge role as well, because not everybody responds to the virus the same. And some people can come back sooner
Mhm,
than others, and some people it takes longer.
mhm,
So kind of describe, you need to thread that needle of where when you're giving yourself enough time to recover and you're not pushing things too hard,
mhm.
but when you're able to, you're opportunistic about it.
So what
So
is like the next week? So now let's say I'm 2 weeks since I first tested positive, and probably a week, more than a week since I had like the most intense symptoms. What is the next week in terms of like activity levels look like for me?
So I'm going to say based on like we're going to keep going back and forth essentially daily. So I think it's what I would do for any athlete who's coming back from injury or illness. It's kind of you need that individualization, and we we want to make sure that we're not aggravating symptoms. And you're still learning what that means for you in terms of this fuzzy light head thing. So what I want to try is to have a little bit more consistency with that sort of 30 to 45-minute range, and then
Mhm,
see not only if we can, not pushing for it, but what happens if we get that a couple of days back to back? Does that make things worse, kind of thing? Because
mhm,
it's not only that individual day, it's the accumulation of those days throughout the week as well that we need to be mindful of.
mhm,
So from my point of view, I would like to be proven that that's okay before
mhm,
that gets pushed too much further. Like I don't have any issues. Like if you're feeling comfortable and you want to go out for a super chill ski on the weekend and that happens to go up to an hour, like use your own discretion kind of thing. But that's kind of where I think that we need to play for the next like week until we prove that that is okay, and then we
mhm,
slowly notch things up from there. And then like from my own learning perspective, like when you've proven that that's okay, then you slowly introduce intensity, and it's kind of counterintuitive as well. Like again, I was having some lung issues, but I wasn't causing those bronchospasms anymore. Again, I'm not saying that this is what people should do. This is what I did. So I started pushing my lungs with little bouts of intensity to begin with, 15 to 20-second spurts, and doing that throughout the course of an hour, maybe doing like starting with 6 one day and then building that up to 8, 10, 12 of those, and just seeing like in my capacity would just drop off. So that's when I would stop. I wouldn't push past that. And then the next week, I found that I didn't lose capacity doing that. So then I would go
mhm,
and I would try longer. I did 30-second reps. And then I found where that dropped off and my lungs stopped working. So I never pushed past that, but I always pushed up to it, kind of thing. So again, that's not being, hey, like not being nailed down to the, well, I wrote down I was going to do 6 2-minute intervals today. I only got 4 done. Well, that's great. You got 0 done last week. So kind of thing. So just looking for the steady progress, but not pushing things beyond that failure point, and not causing inflammation to stick around sort of like post activity. I found to be very important.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that accumulation thing is something that probably we neglect in our thinking of, okay, today was good. I'm going to go do 3 times as long, whatever ride run the
Yeah,
next day because oh, this is proven success, but you don't think of like that long-term proof. So I think that's an interesting point. What are some things that I can do outside of that? Like, so I started taking, I mean, I always take like kind of a daily multivitamin, and I think vitamin D. I'm also going pretty deep into that, but like, what other things would you recommend also other than sleep? Sleeping a
yeah,
lot.
sleep is super important. So I sent you a link the other day to this FLCC protocol,
Hmm.
which is a group of doctors, which is kind of formed this group, which is going based on the current research without the political pressures attached to what's going on, and pushing for supplements that are proven to help instead of needing like a pharmaceutical intervention as well. Again, I can't officially prescribe or recommend anything that's out of my scope of practice, but from personal experience, that list is pretty comprehensive and things that can be done to help. And it's all fairly easy stuff, most of which you can pick up at the pharmacy or order online. So things that looking back in time again, that if I knew early on, I would totally be doing. And that is so COVID likes to hide in the deep, dark places of your body. The virus just kind of goes and hides in your sinuses, in the back of your throat, in your eyes, in your digestive tract. And it just goes and it sticks in there and it just doesn't go away. And even though it's just this little bit of virus that is left there, it sticks your immune system into overdrive. So my thinking is that the more you can do to discourage that early on, the better. And you see in that FLCC protocol, they recommend the antiseptic mouthwash to rinse out your throat. And you can also do saline, like saltwater rinses of your nasal passages. So I would be doing that 2 to 3 times a day, every day, to help rinse that out. And also saline eye drops to help rinse the eyes out
Wow.
as well. Um, so that is something like having these eyes that are just aching and feel like they've been stuck open for weeks is not a whole lot of fun. So yeah, so that is an easy thing that can be done, fairly low cost, which could have a pretty big impact in stopping that virus from settling down in those places.
That's so crazy. That's the eyes, like you would never even think of, but now you say that and I'm like, oh, that makes sense because I feel like
Yeah,
my eyes have been so heavy all the time. Like middle of the day, you're like, oh.
yeah. And it's places your immune system has a hard time getting, like doesn't normally fight things that are going on there. That's my understanding of it anyways. It's
Mhm.
hard for your body to fight infection that settles in these places. Um, a, a good probiotic is helpful because there's a lot
Mhm.
of GI dysfunction that can come
Yeah.
along with COVID. So that can be very helpful. Um, and then things to support energy levels and mitochondrial function, because there's a lot of mitochondrial dysfunction that comes along with COVID, which also can help you metabolize the virus and the corresponding spike protein that it also produces, which causes your immune system to go into overdrive. So on the sheet, there's a specific mitochondrial supplement that it recommends. You can kind of look into that because I don't know what's available where you're at. But the B complex vitamins are good for
Mhm.
energy. Magnesium is great for brain function and cognitive function. That B2 vitamin, the riboflavin, is very good for neurological function. Melatonin, which people normally think of, well, this is to help people sleep. But the melatonin molecule is very good for
Mm.
nervous system inflammation. So it's not being prescribed in that protocol for sleep, it's being prescribed to help the inflammation in your nervous system.
Mm.
I found that one to be a really big help in terms of helping to relieve the pressure and the pain in my neck and the
Wow.
pressure in my head. The melatonin really helped. Um, Zinc, I also found really helpful as well. So again, that's supporting the metabolism and the immune system, along with
Mhm.
that vitamin D that you're already taking.
That the melatonin part is interesting. I'm not super like well versed on it either. I'd be interested. Have you ever talked with Nick about this as well?
No, I haven't had a chance to talk with Nick about this. My understanding is that you want to, like with any supplement, the quality matters.
Yeah.
And you want one that is a prolonged release so that it affects your sleep less. And
Hmm.
that so it's more of a slow release instead of something that's just like
Right.
bam, you're super groggy kind of thing.
Yeah, because I at one point was taking like melatonin just to help me sleep, and
Hmm.
I remember Nick got me off of it because of like the way it plays in with like serotonin, something like that. But so I'd be because he knows so much more about it, I'd be super interested like
Yeah,
and I
I
think he'd be
think it
interested to hear your story too.
yeah, and again, I think it really depends on the intervention and the purpose of what you're
Yeah.
trying to use things for. Um, and again, I'd be very open to talking to Nick about some of this. So my understanding of melatonin, I used to not take it as well because I thought that I didn't want to have too much melatonin in my body and have my body not like pretty much decide that it's going to be lazy, not produce its own melatonin and disrupt that sleep cycle
Hmm.
and other hormones that are required for that normal circadian rhythm,
Yeah.
right? Um, and then I was hesitant to start taking it when I saw it on the list. It's like, well, that's for sleep. I'm more or less sleeping fine. I'm not going to take it. But then I was talking with my naturopath doctor, and she was like, no, that's not for sleep in this instance. That's for neurological
Mm.
inflammation. COVID has hijacked your nervous system, and you need to bring the inflammation down. And melatonin is non-habit forming as
Hmm.
well. So you don't develop a dependency on it.
Mm.
So it is safe to use in relatively high doses to up to about 20 milligrams. But taking high doses of it can cause some pretty interesting nightmares.
Oh my gosh.
Like it just gives you like the crazy whacked out dreams, right?
Oh,
Um,
geez, I already have those without it, so it is tough.
but I think the FLCC recommends like 8 or 9 milligrams, but I was told to build up to it like in very slow amounts, just to see what you tolerate. And I don't even really notice it anymore. I'm taking about 12 milligrams and I don't find it really makes me all that groggy anymore, but I'm not better and things are starting to work for me, so I'm not going to change that protocol for myself right
Hmm.
now.
Hmm.
But I found that one to be very helpful. So again, you get to kind of weigh the pros and cons of the intervention of what you're trying to do and your immediate needs, and that's why I chose that melatonin was right for me to take at that point in time.
Yeah, yeah. Man,
Um,
crazy. Well, I'm sorry to hear that you've had such a hell of a journey with that, and it's humbling for me, at least. That's to say the least. But I'm also glad to have you as a resource, and as you said, not to scare me or anybody else, but I mean, it is the reality of potential consequences, and to show that even people who are like athletic and fit and strong
Yeah, yeah.
can wind up in that place. Even when your body you think is like ready to fight off anything and you're running like crazy amounts. Well, for me, conceptually crazy. But yeah, I
You
think it's
bike crazy amounts that are just mind blowing to me. So
I bike
it's
the distance, you go running. So that's
yeah. Yeah, I think that's like there's so much like there's no information out there. Most people, at least in Canada, still barely know that long COVID even exists. If most people, oh, it's just mild lung infection, you
yeah,
might have be sick for a week, but there's no education component on the potential
yeah,
long-term effects or guideline. Like there's some guidelines on return to sport, but they're not very specific,
yeah,
really. So I just, again, I think it's important. I want to be a part of the conversation. I feel like I've got lots to share.
yeah,
I'm not better, but I'm getting better. And the more that I can do to help people like you have a better chance to not end up like me,
yeah.
that's, I guess, would make me happy to be able to help out in that regard.
Yeah, that's super powerful, and I appreciate you being open to sharing that. And I know it's like psychologically not easy to kind of like, I guess as athletes, you don't want to like admit weaknesses. And I mean, the same thing you said about your employment, and
Yeah.
having to go on disability. I think I think it's very like brave of you to be so open to talk about it and help people further. So I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, no problem. Like I said there's lots to be gained about participating in the conversation. And the more
Yeah.
that's out there, the more it can help people. So I'm happy to share.